The gavel had not yet fallen when Chester Covington leaned across the split-rail fence and asked the woman with fire in her eyes a question that had nothing to do with horses. "What is your name?" Ida Garrison turned so fast the brim of her sun-worn hat nearly clipped his jaw. Her hand was still raised mid-bid, her voice still ringing in the dry autumn air above the Caldwell, Kansas auction yard, and the entire crowd of ranchers, traders, and idling cowboys had gone so quiet they might have been wax figures. The auctioneer himself paused, thumb hooked in his suspenders, watching. Ida's gaze found Chester's face, and what she saw there stopped the sharp answer rising in her throat. He was not smirking, he was not trying to rattle her. He was completely, terrifyingly sincere, his gray eyes steady as deep water, waiting for her answer as if the $1,000 bay mare standing in the ring behind her did not exist, as if the entire auction yard had shrunk to the 2 feet of charged air between them. "You are asking me my name," she said slowly, "in the middle of my bid. I am. While I am actively trying to win that horse. I noticed." She stared at him for 3 full seconds. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He looked like a man who had made a decision and intended to stand behind it regardless of what the world thought, and something about that quiet certainty hit Ida Garrison square in the chest like a thrown stone. "Ida," she said, and she was not entirely sure why she gave it to him so easily. "Ida Garrison." The faintest ghost of a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. He nodded once as if she had confirmed something he had suspected. "Chester Covington," he said, "and I hope you win her." Then he stepped back, folded his arms, and went completely silent again, and Ida spun back to the ring and outbid every man left standing, her heart doing something irrational and inconvenient in her ribs the entire time. That was how it started. That was the single, ordinary, extraordinary moment that would unravel everything careful and guarded she had built around herself in the 3 years since her husband Roy Garrison had died and left her with a failing cattle operation, a mountain of debt, and a name that every banker and land speculator in Sumner County had learned to use with pity or contempt. She did not know yet what Chester Covington carried in his own silences, what dark past lived in those steady gray eyes, what forced choice had sent him drifting into Caldwell, Kansas on a Wednesday in October of 1882 with no livestock, no visible companions, and apparently nothing to do but ask a woman her name at precisely the worst possible moment. She did not know any of that yet, but she was about to find out. 3 weeks before the auction, Ida Garrison had stood in the Caldwell First Commercial Bank and listened to a man named Harold Pruitt explain in his soft, regretful, utterly merciless voice that the Garrison Ranch had 60 days to satisfy its outstanding debt, or the property would be seized and auctioned. Pruitt had a gold watch chain and sympathetic eyes, and absolutely no intention of showing her any mercy. She had known him for 9 years. He had bounced her eldest boy on his knee at the 4th of July celebration in 1875. None of that meant anything when there were figures on a ledger. 60 days, Mrs. Garrison, he had said. She had walked out into the pale October sun and stood on the boardwalk and let the wind off the Kansas prairie push against her face, and she had thought, without panic, with the cold, precise clarity that had kept her going since Roy's fever took him 18 months ago. "I need a better breeding stud than what I have. I need to get the herd producing calves that will sell, and I need to do it fast enough to matter." The bay mare at the Caldwell auction was no cattle horse. She was a registered quarter-horse mare with bloodlines that went back to Steel Dust himself, and her foals would command prices that could turn a struggling operation around inside of 2 seasons if you crossed her to the right stallion. Ida had ridden 2 hours on her aging gelding Copperhead to get to that auction. She had saved $240 in a tobacco tin under the floorboards of her kitchen. She had brought every cent of it. The bidding had climbed past what she'd planned. Past 150, past 200. The men in the yard threw bids back and forth like it was sport, and Ida stood at the fence and raised her hand each time with the precise, controlled fury of a woman who had come too far and needed this too much to be rational about it. When the gavel finally fell at $230 and the auctioneer pointed at Ida, the crowd applauded with the reflexive politeness of men who had just been beaten by a woman and were not entirely sure how to feel about it. A few of them looked irritated. One broad-shouldered rancher from the south end of the county muttered something to his companion that Ida did not hear but felt the shape of. She did not care. She had the mare. She walked to the payment table with her tobacco tin and her chin level, and she counted out the bills and the coins with steady hands, and the whole time she was aware, in a way she did not want to examine, that Chester Covington was still somewhere behind her in that yard, quiet as a fence post and twice as solid. She collected the lead rope attached to the mare's halter, and she had almost made it to the gate when a voice she had not expected called her name. "Mrs. Garrison." She turned. Chester was standing 5 feet away with his hat in his hands, not because of any particular courtesy, it seemed, but because he had just taken it off to run his fingers through his dark hair, which had a few threads of silver at the temples that she had not noticed before at the fence. He was perhaps 34, 35, lean through the shoulders but not slight. There was something about the way he held himself, careful and self-contained, like a man who had learned to take up as little space as possible in rooms where he was not sure of his welcome. "Mr. Covington," she said, matching his formality, wondering why her pulse was behaving the way it was. "I know it is not my business," he said, "but I noticed your mare has a favor on her left rear fetlock, just a slight swelling. You will want to keep her out of hard ground for the first week." Ida looked down at the mare's left rear leg, and he was right. A faint puffiness she had not caught in the excitement of the bidding. She had looked at that leg. She had thought she had checked everything. The knowledge that she had missed it, and that this quiet stranger had not, produced an embarrassing warmth in her face that she covered by crouching to run her hand along the fetlock herself. "It is not serious," he said, crouching beside her without being invited, near enough that she could smell trail dust and cedar soap. "But it will be if you push her." "I know how to care for a horse," Ida said. "I did not suggest you did not." She straightened and looked at him directly, and he looked back with that same unsettling quality of complete, unhurried attention. "Why are you here if you did not buy anything?" she asked. Something moved across his face. Not evasion exactly, but care, the careful management of what he chose to show. "I was looking," he said, "at horses. Partly." The honesty of that half-admission, delivered so plainly, caught her off guard. Men in her experience either lied comprehensively or told you nothing. They did not hand you a piece of the truth with both hands and let you make of it what you would. "Well," she said, and found she had nothing sharp or dismissive to follow it with. "Thank you for the warning about her leg." She turned to go. "How far are you riding?" he asked. "About 2 hours north." "Alone?" "I manage alone quite well, Mr. Covington." "I did not doubt it," he said, and again there was nothing in his voice that she could call condescension. "But the weather is turning and that mare should not be pressed. I am heading north myself. I would not crowd you." Ida Garrison stood there at the gate of the Caldwell auction yard with her newly purchased mare and her nearly empty tobacco tin, and the October sky shifting from blue to the color of pewter above the flat Kansas horizon, and she made a practical decision. "You may ride alongside if you keep pace," she said. "I do not need conversation." "That works perfectly for me," Chester Covington said. He had a horse tied at the post outside the yard. A gray roan gelding with quiet eyes and a good deep chest. A working horse, not a show horse, cared for meticulously, the tack clean and well-oiled. Ida noted all of this in the practiced way she noted everything, automatically cataloging information about people through the state of their animals. They rode north out of Caldwell as the first clouds began building in the west, and for the first half-hour Chester Covington said absolutely nothing, and Ida discovered that she did not mind. She had half expected him to fill the silence with the way men often did when they rode alongside a woman alone, with questions about her situation, with opinions about her choices, with the particular flavor of unsolicited concern that was really a test of availability. He did none of those things. He rode at an easy distance to her right, his eyes moving over the landscape in the systematic way of a man who had learned to read the land for reasons she had not yet determined, and he let the silence be exactly what it was. After a while, Ida found herself relaxing in ways she had not intended. "You are not from here," she said, because it was a statement of fact that she could make without it feeling like an invitation. "No," he said. "Where from?" A pause that was not evasive so much as deliberate, like a man choosing which true thing to say. "Missouri, originally. I have been moving around some." "How long?" 3 years. 3 years. The same length of time since Roy had died. The same length of time she had been running the Garrison ranch on her own. She did not say that aloud. "What is in Caldwell for you?" she asked. "I am not sure yet," he said. "I heard there was good range land up this way. I have been thinking about settling." She looked at him sideways. He was not looking at her. He was watching a red-tailed hawk riding a thermal above the brown November grasses. "You do not seem like a man who settles easily," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I do not." The rain that had been threatening since Caldwell reached them about 4 miles north of town, and it came in the way autumn rain in Kansas comes in, without ceremony, cold and determined, and suddenly everywhere. Ida pulled her coat tighter and kept riding, and the mare, who was young and unused to her, and slightly unsettled by the weather, began dancing sideways in that nervous way that new horses did when they were uncertain of their handler. Chester moved his roan quietly up on the mare's left without being asked, not crowding her, just providing a steady presence on the side she was shying from, and the mare settled within a quarter mile. He dropped back again after that without a word, as if it had never happened. Ida did not thank him immediately. She kept riding and let the gratitude sit in her chest and grow specific before she spoke it. "That was well done," she said finally. "She is a good horse," he said. "Just new." "We are all just new at something," Ida said, and surprised herself by meaning it in more than one direction. By the time they reached the turnoff for the Garrison property, the rain had settled into a steady gray curtain over the flat land, and the light was fading toward an early dusk. Chester reined in at the fork in the road where the track to the ranch branched from the main north road, and he did not suggest coming further. "Thank you for the company," Ida said, and found she meant it plainly. "Thank you for permitting it," he said. She hesitated. The mare shifted under her, eager for the barn. The rain tapped on the brim of her hat. "If you are looking for work," Ida said, and the words came out before she had fully authorized them, "I have a ranch that is short 2 hands and a deadline that does not care about either. I cannot pay much, room and board and a small wage." Chester Covington looked at her steadily through the rain. There was something in his face she could not name, a kind of wondering that he was doing his best not to show, and underneath it something that looked dangerously close to relief. "What time do you start in the morning?" he said. "First light. I will be there." He turned his roan back toward the main road and rode without looking back, and Ida Garrison watched him go and thought, with a practical woman's ruthless honesty, that she had just done something either very sensible or very dangerous, and she was not entirely sure which. The Garrison Ranch was 160 acres of decent prairie grass, a small creek that ran year-round on its western edge, a modest but well-built house, a barn that needed work on its south wall, and a herd of 62 head of cattle that were doing adequately but not spectacularly well. Roy had been a good man and a passable rancher, and he had loved Ida with a steady, uncomplicated devotion that she had valued completely. She was not in the habit of comparing what she'd had to anything else. But she had been running this ranch with her own 2 hands and the help of a 15-year-old boy named Ellis Purdy, who was earnest and willing, and not yet experienced enough to compensate for everything that needed doing. And the honest truth was that she was behind in ways that the 60-day deadline made critical. Chester Covington arrived at first light on Thursday morning exactly as he had said, on the roan gelding with a single pack roll behind the saddle, and no complaints about the accommodation, which was the bunkhouse attached to the east end of the barn. Ida showed him the property, the south wall of the barn that needed new planking, the section of fence lying down in the lower pasture, the water situation at the creek crossing, and the new mare settling into the third stall. He asked practical questions. How old were the cattle? What had they been fed through last winter? Had there been any sickness in the herd in the past year? What was the soil composition in the lower pasture? He asked about the mare's feeding, about the condition of the stallion she had in mind for breeding, about the timeline for the foals to be born and sold. Ida answered all of it, and he listened the way he had listened at the auction fence, with complete attention and zero performance. And by the end of the property walk, she had a very clear sense that Chester Covington knew what he was doing and had known a great deal more than the wandering quality of his circumstances suggested. "Where did you ranch before?" she asked, as they stood at the downed fence line in the lower pasture. "My family had land in Jackson County," he said. He was examining the snapped fence post with his hands, testing the soil around it. Before the war, before the war. The language of a whole generation of men from Missouri, who had come out of the 1860s with their land gone and their families fractured, and their histories complicated in ways that the rest of the country preferred not to examine too closely. Missouri during the war had been a place of secret loyalties and neighbor-against-neighbor violence and atrocities on both sides that left marks no newspaper reported fully. Ida had grown up in Ohio. She had her own version of those years and what they had done to families. "The land is gone," she said. Yes, she did not ask for more. He did not offer it. But something shifted between them, the slight molecular change that happens when two people recognize a shared quality in each other, the quality of having lost something enormous and decided to keep going anyway. "The post needs to come out entirely," Chester said. "The rot goes all the way down. I will need a new one cut." "There is timber in the creek stand," Ida said. "Ellis knows where the tools are." By the end of the first week, Chester had repaired the south wall of the barn, reset 4 fence posts, reorganized the hay storage in a way that would prevent the moisture damage that had been quietly ruining bales for 2 seasons, and established an easy working rapport with Ellis Purdy that involved a great deal of patient showing rather than telling. Ellis, who had been slightly wary of the new hand at first in the territorial way of young men, who are used to being the only male presence in a working operation, had unbent considerably after Chester spent an afternoon teaching him how to properly evaluate a horse's gait without saying a single condescending word. Ida watched all of this from the distances of her work and tried to be analytical about what she observed. Chester was competent. He was reliable. He was not given to the small dramatic gestures by which men often announce their value, the showing off, the visible effort signaling, the complaints about difficulty. He worked with a focused quietness that made the work look natural, which she knew from long experience meant the opposite of easy. He ate what was put in front of him without comment. He went to the bunkhouse at the appropriate time without being prompted. He did not drink, or if he did it with a restraint that left no evidence. He did not try to take over. This was the thing that Ida had feared most without letting herself name it when she made the offer at the rain-soaked fork in the road. Men who came to work for a woman alone often arrived with a secondary agenda that announced itself gradually, and then suddenly. The gentle beginning assumption that the woman needed steering, that the man's judgment should supersede hers, that the invitation to work was also an invitation to lead. Chester showed none of this. He deferred to her decisions with the same naturalness with which he deferred to her property lines. It was her ranch. It was her herd. It was her call. The first time he disagreed with her, it was about the bay mare. It was 11 days after the auction, and Ida had decided to begin light work with the mare to see how she responded to training. Chester was in the paddock with her when Ida came out with the long line, and he looked at the mare's left rear fetlock with his careful eyes and said, "I would wait another 4 days." "The swelling is almost gone," Ida said. "Almost," he agreed. She looked at him. He was looking at the horse, not at her. "You think I am rushing her," Ida said. "I think you have a deadline," he said, "and deadlines make the wrong things feel urgent." The word deadline hit something specific in her chest. She had not told him about the bank. She had said nothing about Harold Prout or the 60 days or the debt that sat over the ranch like a second sky. "What deadline do you mean?" she asked carefully. He turned to look at her then, and in the pale morning light his gray eyes had a quality she could only describe as regret, not pity, something more equal than that. "I do not know your particulars," he said, "but a ranch this capable with a crew this small, running at the pace you are running at, has a reason. And the reason in Sumner County in 1882 usually has to do with a banker." Ida was quiet for a moment. "Harold Prout," she said. 60 days from 3 weeks ago." Chester nodded slowly. "Tell me the full picture," he said. She told him. All of it, the debt amounts, the cattle situation, what she needed the mare to produce, and when the plan she had built in her head for how the foals from the right breeding could change the financial picture in the next 2 seasons. She told him in the flat, factual way she told herself things, without drama, without self-pity, laying out the problem the way you laid out a map before a difficult journey. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the mare. "The breeding plan will work," he said, "but 2 seasons is not fast enough for the debt you have described. I know. Your cattle are not producing at capacity because you have been short-handed for too long. If we can get the herd healthy before winter and sell the calves in the spring sale at Wichita instead of locally, you will get better prices. Wichita buyers are paying 40% more than Caldwell right now. I cannot get to Wichita on my own." "No," he said, "but with 3 people who know what they are doing, you can." She looked at him. There was something in his voice that was careful and considered, and also something warmer underneath it, something that was trying not to be visible. "That is a great deal of involvement for a man who said he was only thinking about settling," she said. Chester looked back at the mare. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I think I have found a reason," he said. The danger of that sentence was not that it was presumptuous. It was that it was not. He said it like a man naming a fact, not staking a claim, and Ida Garrison had to turn away and look at the flat land stretching to the north and do something about the expression on her face before she trusted herself to speak. "4 more days for the mare," she said. "4 more days," he agreed. November came in cold and working. They were up before light every morning and rarely stopped before dark, and the rhythm of the work created the particular intimacy of people who are trusting each other with difficult, necessary things. Chester and Ellis mended the remaining fence lines and evaluated the herd with a methodical thoroughness that identified 3 cattle with early signs of pink eye and separated them before the infection could spread. Ida rode the property lines and managed the accounts and negotiated with the grain supplier in town for a better price on winter feed. And she came home each evening to a barn that was incrementally more prepared for winter than it had been when she left. She did not know when she started noticing the smaller things about Chester. It happened without announcement, the way important things often did. She noticed that he always made sure there was hot coffee on the stove when she came in from an early morning ride. She noticed that when he read in the evenings, which he did by the light of the bunkhouse lamp, he read seriously, and when she had once glimpsed the spine of the book, it was a volume of Emerson. She noticed that when he talked to Ellis, he was careful to be instructive without being diminishing, building the boy's confidence at the same time he was building his skill. She noticed that when he looked at her, it lasted a half-second longer than necessary, and when she caught him at it, he did not look away guiltily, but simply completed the look and then moved on, as if looking at her was a thing he was doing honestly and did not intend to be ashamed of. He had a scar along his left jawline. faint enough that you only saw it in certain light, and she found herself wondering about it with an interest she did not fully discipline. The moment she admitted to herself that she was developing feelings for Chester Covington was a Sunday in mid-November when she came home from the weekly trip to Caldwell to find him in the barn with the bay mare, not working, just standing with her in the quiet way he had, his hand on her neck, talking to her in a low voice that Ida could not hear from the doorway. The mare, who was still skittish with most people, was standing absolutely still with her nose pressed against Chester's shoulder, and the quality of the scene, its uncomplicated gentleness, its complete absence of performance, hit Ida somewhere unguarded and stayed there. She backed out of the barn without being seen and stood in the cold November air and had a perfectly honest conversation with herself. She was a widow of 3 years. She was 31 years old. She was in debt to Harold Prout and in danger of losing everything Roy had built and she had preserved. She had hired a man she did not know about whom she knew almost nothing beyond the facts of his competence and the quality of his character as she had observed it over 6 weeks. She could not afford the distraction. She could not afford the vulnerability. She had learned during the hard years since Roy's death that feelings were a luxury that the practical management of survival could not always accommodate. All of this was true. Also true, she had not felt like this since before Roy died, since before the fever and the debt and the slow, quiet erosion of everything except the work. She had not felt seen in this particular way, noticed without pressure, valued without conditions, in a span of time that had been long enough to make her believe she might not feel it again. She went back inside and made supper and told herself to be sensible. It was 2 days later that the secret started. She was in the Caldwell General Store collecting supplies when she overheard 2 men talking in the back section where the saddle hardware was kept. She was not trying to eavesdrop. She was reaching for a box of lamp oil, and the shelves were tall, and she was effectively hidden from view, and the men were not being discreet. One of the men was Tom Ridley, who owned a spread southeast of hers and had been part of the bidding at the auction. The other she did not recognize immediately, a shorter man with a narrow face who turned out to be one of Ridley's hired men when he shifted into her sightline. "Covington," the narrow-faced man said. "Chester Covington. I know that name. Where from?" Ridley said. He was one of the Covington boys out of Jackson County. Their old man was in deep with some of the Quantrill people. That was 20 years ago. Does not matter. The boy was the one who testified. Federal court after the war. Turned on his own people to keep the land, they said. Land went anyway, but he still testified. Ruined 3 families in Jackson County. Ridley said, in a tone that held judgment and dismissal in equal measure. And now he is working for the Garrison widow. Ida stood very still in the lamp oil aisle. "If Prout gets that property," the narrow-faced man said, "Ridley, you could pick up that creek land for almost nothing." "I am aware," Ridley said. She heard them moving away and she stayed where she was for a long moment, holding the box of lamp oil, the words rearranging themselves in her mind. Turned on his own people to keep the land. Federal court testimony. Jackson County. She finished her shopping in silence and rode home through the cold, and she thought about it the whole way, and by the time she reached the ranch she had decided 2 things. First, she would not take second-hand information from overheard conversations as fact. Second, she would ask Chester directly. She asked him that evening after supper, while Ellis was out checking on the cattle. They were both still at the table and the lamp was lit between them, and she looked at him across the table and said, "I heard something today in Caldwell that I want to give you the chance to address." He went very still. The quality of his stillness changed, became something braced. "Tell me what you heard," he said. She told him. All of it, the names, the testimony, the Quantrill connection, the ruin of families. Chester was quiet for a long time. The lamp flame moved in a small breath of air from somewhere. "The broad shape of it is true," he said. "Tell me the full shape." He looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked up at her, and what she saw in his face was the careful, costly honesty of a man who had decided the truth was worth losing something over. "My father had associations with men who rode with Quantrill," he said. "He did not ride with them himself, or so I believed then. After the war, when the federal investigations came, it became clear that his involvement was deeper than he had told us. 3 men in our county were facing charges that carried capital sentences. My father was among the people who could be called to testify." He paused. "He asked me to say nothing. He said it would protect the family." "But you testified," Ida said. "I testified," Chester said. "Because the men being investigated had burned a free Negro settlement along the Blue River in 1863, 4 people killed. The men facing charges were the ones who had given the order. I was 19 years old, and I had seen something that summer that I had not understood until the federal investigators explained what it was. I had seen those men meet with my father." He stopped. "I could not stay silent about what I knew. Not for that." Ida looked at him. "Your father's land was seized anyway," she said. "Yes. He died 2 years later. He called it betrayal." Chester's voice was level and flat, and she could hear underneath the level flatness everything it had cost him to hold it level. "My brother has not spoken to me since 1866. I have been traveling around since then, working where I can, trying to find somewhere that does not know the story. And Caldwell knew it. Someone always knows it," he said. "It is the nature of things you cannot undo." Ida sat with that. The lamp burned. Outside, the Kansas wind moved through the dry grass. "Do you regret it?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "No," he said. "I regret the cost. I do not regret the choice." That was the thing that did it, the final, irreversible thing. Ida had built her whole adult life on the principle that the difference between a good person and a rationalizing one was what they did when doing right was expensive. She had watched Roy be that kind of good man, consistently, quietly, at cost. She had tried to be it herself. And here was Chester Covington, carrying the price of his integrity across 16 years and 2,000 miles of American prairie, and he had just handed her the whole story without asking for her sympathy or her absolution or anything at all except the chance to be truthful. "I heard something else," she said, because she had to say it all now. "Ridley wants this land. He is expecting Prout to seize it and sell it cheap." Chester's eyes sharpened. "Ridley is in communication with Prout. That was the implication." "Then you have less than 60 days, Chester said, and the quietness in him had shifted to something harder and more urgent. "If Prout moves the deadline, you will not have time to get the cattle to Wichita in the spring." "I know. We need to change the strategy. Tell me." They sat at that table until nearly midnight, and what they built together in those hours was not just a financial plan, but something else. A partnership of the specific kind that forms between 2 people who have both decided that honesty is worth more than comfort, who have both learned to trust the quality of another person's thinking, because the quality of their character was already established. Chester knew cattle markets and logistics and the particular economics of prairie ranching in a way that went beyond anything he had casually mentioned. He knew which buyers in Wichita dealt in volume and which ones prized quality bloodlines. He knew the timing windows for the spring cattle market and the rail schedule out of Wichita and the current price differentials between grade cattle and registered stock. By midnight they had a plan. It was tight. It required everything to go reasonably well and left no room for disaster. It was the best plan available. When Ida finally stood to clear the lamp and say good night, Chester stood too, and they were briefly closer together than they had been before. The small geography of the table and the late hour and the work they had just done together conspiring to put them in the same narrow piece of warm kitchen air. "Thank you," Ida said, "for telling me the truth tonight." "Thank you," Chester said, "for asking it like you wanted it." She looked up at him. He was looking at her with that expression she had stopped pretending she did not notice, the one that was careful and warm and completely genuine. "I should say good night," she said. "Yes," he agreed, and neither of them moved for another moment. "Good night, Chester. Good night, Ida." She did not sleep well, but the sleeplessness was not unpleasant. December arrived with a hard freeze that changed the texture of everything. The cattle needed more monitoring. The water situation at the creek crossing required daily attention to keep it from icing over, and the days were short enough that the work had to be planned with care to fit the available daylight. The three of them moved through it with the well-practiced coordination of people who had learned each other's rhythms, and there was something in the daily necessity of it that was its own form of intimacy, the knowing of how someone worked, how they moved through difficulty, what they did when a thing went wrong. What Chester did when a thing went wrong was assess, decide, and act in rapid, quiet sequence without drama or complaint. The morning the barn roof showed a leak above the hay storage, he was up on it before Ida had finished breakfast. The afternoon, 2 steers got through a gate that the freeze had made unreliable and wandered toward the creek. He and Ellis had them back in the pasture inside 40 minutes without a word of blame about the gate. It was in these small material facts that trust built itself into something structural. They also talked more. Not about the past, or not only about it, but about everything, the way two people who have found each other genuinely interesting begin to fill available time with conversation, the way water fills available space. Chester had opinions about land management and politics and books that were specific and considered, and sometimes surprising. He had read more than she had expected from a man who carried everything he owned on the back of a roan gelding. He had thoughts about the movement for women's suffrage that were unambiguous and ahead of what most men in Sumner County would have acknowledged. And when she said so, he shrugged and said that he had once watched his mother run a farm alone for 4 years during the war, and anyone who thought women were incapable of complex decisions had not been paying attention. She told him about Ohio, about growing up on her father's small farm, about the particular quality of the Ohio River in summer, about the Methodist church where she had gone every Sunday, and the way the singing had always felt like the most honest thing about organized religion. She told him about meeting Roy at 21, about coming west, about the hard early years building the Garrison property when the range was nothing but grass and optimism. She told him about Roy's illness. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. She watched him receive all of this the way he received everything, with complete attention and no performance. "I think," Chester said one December evening when they were sitting in the kitchen after supper and Ellis had gone to bed early with a winter cold, "that you are one of the most competent people I have ever met." Ida looked up from the account book she had been working on. "That is a practical compliment." "It is also a genuine one," he said. He was at the other end of the table with the Emerson. "I mean the whole of it, the way you think, the way you make decisions, the way you manage what is difficult without making everything about the difficulty." She was quiet for a moment. The compliment was landing somewhere more central than she wanted it to. "Roy used to say I was too practical," she said. "I think he was wrong," Chester said. He turned a page. She went back to the accounts, and the kitchen was warm and quiet, and outside the Kansas wind was making its measured sound against the windows, and Ida Garrison felt something she had thought was years behind her, the simple, profound comfort of not being alone. The problem arrived in the second week of December in the shape of a man named Gordon Webb. Webb rode in on a Tuesday afternoon on a tall black horse that was tired from hard riding, and clearly not treated as well as the horse deserved. He was 40-odd, thick through the chest, with a smile that went wide and did not reach his eyes. He said he was an independent land agent passing through, looking at properties. He said he had heard the Garrison Ranch might be open to offers. Chester was in the south pasture with Ellis when Webb arrived, and Ida received him on the porch. "I am not selling," she said pleasantly. "Now, Mrs. Garrison, a woman in your situation ought to hear all her options," Webb said, and the particular way he said "woman in your situation," with its implication of helplessness and inevitable surrender, struck Ida as deliberately chosen. My situation, she said, involves a great deal of work that I need to get back to. Thank you for your visit. Webb's smile did not change. I represent interests that could make this very easy for you, he said. The figure we are prepared to offer is fair. Who do you represent? Ida asked. A consortium, Webb said. Local investors, men who see the potential in this land. Would one of those investors be named Ridley? Something moved in Webb's face. It was quickly controlled. I am not at liberty to name my principals, he said. Then I am not at liberty to hear your offer, Ida said. Good afternoon, Mr. Webb. She went inside and closed the door and stood in the front room and let the anger move through her in a controlled way, from chest to throat to hands and out, the way she had learned to manage it over the years. Then she went to find Chester. He listened to the full account of the conversation, leaning against the paddock fence with his arms folded, and his expression was a careful, controlled version of what she recognized as the same controlled anger she had just talked herself through. Webb is Ridley's instrument, Chester said, and Ridley is communicating with Pruitt at the bank. They are trying to force a sale before the deadline so they do not even have to wait for a default. Can they force a sale? Not legally, Chester said, but if they can create enough pressure, enough difficulty, enough uncertainty about what you face, a woman alone with a failing operation might choose to sell rather than fight. He looked at her. They do not know you. No, Ida agreed. They do not. I want a ride to Caldwell tomorrow, Chester said. There is a man I know who practices law out of the land office. I want to look at Pruitt's paperwork, what he can and cannot legally do, and whether the debt terms have any vulnerability. You know a lawyer in Caldwell. I have had occasion to need lawyers, Chester said dryly, and to learn which ones can be trusted. The lawyer's name was Ambrose Fitch, a spare, precise man in his 60s who wore a three-piece suit in the middle of winter as a kind of personal statement, and who treated Chester Covington with the careful respect of someone who had seen him navigate a difficult situation competently before. Fitch looked at the copies of the loan documents Ida had brought, and he looked at them for a long time, and then he took off his spectacles and polished them with his handkerchief. The acceleration clause, Fitch said, has a notice requirement. Pruitt must provide 60 days written notice before he can accelerate the debt. When did you receive the written notice? Ida thought. I received the verbal notice on October the 4th. I have no written notice. Fitch put his spectacles back on. Then legally, he said, the 60 days has not begun. He cannot act on the debt without serving you proper written notice first. Chester looked at Ida. Ida looked at Fitch. He told me 60 days, she said. Verbally, Fitch said in the tone of a man who has seen banks do this before, which is either an oversight or a deliberate pressure tactic. Either way it works in your favor. You serve Pruitt with a demand for proper written notice pursuant to the terms of the original loan agreement, and his 60 days starts from the day he serves you correctly. That gives you until mid-February at the earliest. Mid-February. That was the spring cattle market in Wichita. That was the breeding timeline for the mare. That was possible. Ida sat in Ambrose Fitch's office on a cold December afternoon and felt the particular relief of a woman who has fought hard for something and found that the ground she was standing on was firmer than she had been told it was. She looked at Chester across the lawyer's desk. He was trying not to look satisfied and not entirely succeeding. On the ride back from Caldwell, with the papers from Fitch's office in her saddlebag and the winter sun low and flat over the Kansas prairie, Ida said, "How did you know about the notice requirement?" "My father's land," Chester said. "The bank that held his debt had a similar clause. It did not help him in the end, but I learned to read loan documents very carefully afterward." "So the dark past was useful after all," Ida said, and there was a gentleness in it, not mockery. Chester looked at her. "Most things are," he said, "if you look at them honestly." They were side by side on the road, horses walking, the late afternoon light turning everything amber and gold. Ida looked at his profile against the western sky and thought about the past weeks, about what she knew of him now, and she thought about the 19-year-old boy in a federal courthouse in Missouri, who had told the truth about what he had witnessed because he could not do otherwise, who had lost his family and his home and his name's safety in exchange for the knowledge that he had done right, who had carried that exchange across 16 years without bitterness, or not without bitterness exactly, but without letting the bitterness make him smaller. She thought she understood why, when she had been standing at the auction fence in Caldwell throwing bids at the air with both hands, he had looked at her and felt compelled to ask her name. She thought they recognized something in each other, some quality of stubbornness in the direction of the right thing that did not know how to be otherwise. "Chester," she said. He looked at her. She did not have a prepared sentence. She looked at him in the amber afternoon light and said, "I am glad you came to the auction." Something in his face opened in a way she had not seen before. The carefulness he usually wore like a second skin softened, and underneath it was something so simply and directly glad that it stopped her breath. "So am I," he said. They did not say anything else for the remaining miles, but the silence between them had changed into something that felt more like a decision than an absence. Christmas came to the Garrison ranch in the form of a pine bough over the door, a small beef roast that Ellis had contributed with uncharacteristic ceremony, and an evening that was warmer and more complete than any Ida had expected when October had been doing its worst. She had bought Chester a book at the general store in Caldwell, a collection of essays on natural philosophy that she had thought he would like based on the Emerson, and she had told herself it was a practical gesture, acknowledgement of a valuable employee, and she had been lying to herself about that since the moment she paid for it. He had given her something that stopped her entirely. It was a small carved wooden horse, the size of a hand, made from the dense close-grained wood of a piece of cedar he had found at the creek, and it was the bay mare exactly, the set of the head and neck, the slight arch of the back, the particular way she stood when she was calm. He had been carving it in the evenings in the bunkhouse. She had not known. She held it and looked at it, and she could feel Ellis watching both of them from across the room with the alert attention of a 15-year-old who has just understood something. "It is beautiful," she said, and she looked up at Chester and let him see that she meant more than the carving. He held her gaze for a moment, and his face was very still and very open and very warm. "Merry Christmas, Ida," he said. January was hard in the way that Kansas January was always hard, the sky flat and gray for days at a stretch, the cold a constant companion to every outdoor task, the days short and the nights long and the work still relentless. But something had shifted in the architecture of the ranch and the people on it. The plan was working. The cattle were healthier. The mare was thriving. Ellis had grown 2 inches in confidence if not in height. And the two people who came together over the kitchen table most evenings to go over the accounts, and the plans were doing something that had stopped being purely practical sometime in November, and had become something they were both carefully, deliberately, honestly moving toward. Chester kissed her on an evening in late January. They had been going over the revised cattle sale projections with the lamp between them, and Ida had looked up from the figures to make a point about timing, and found that Chester had stopped looking at the paper and was looking at her with an expression so clear and unguarded that the practical point she had been about to make became instantly, entirely irrelevant. He reached across the narrow table and touched her face, one hand, very gentle, and she sat completely still for 1 second, and then she set down her pencil. He leaned across and kissed her, and it was very quiet and very careful, the way he did most things, and then she kissed him back, and it was not quiet or careful at all. It was 3 months of carefully maintained practical distance suddenly absent, and when they pulled back to breathe, they were both looking at each other with the slightly startled quality of people who have just confirmed something large. "I have been trying," Chester said, slightly unsteady, "to be respectful of what you need." "I know," Ida said. "I appreciate it. But I am very much in love with you," he said. The directness of it, the complete plainness of it, hit her the way all his directness hit her, straight and clean. "I know that too," she said, and his expression did something wonderful. "And you," he said. She put her hand on his. "I have been in love with you since December," she said, "and I have been telling myself various sensible things about it since then." "How are those sensible things working out?" he asked. "Not very well," she admitted. He laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh fully without restraint, and it was a low, warm sound that she filed away with the other things she was collecting about him: the cedar smell, the quality of his attention, the way he talked to horses. "I need to ask you something," Chester said, serious again. "Ask it. I am a man with a complicated past in a state where that past has followed me. I do not know if it will continue to follow me here. I do not want to bring trouble to this ranch or to you." "You are not the source of the trouble that is threatening this ranch," Ida said firmly. "Ridley and Prude are, and we are dealing with that. I mean longer than the next 60 days. "So do I," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. "I am not afraid of complicated," Ida said. "I am afraid of dishonest, and you have been consistently, sometimes painfully, honest with me." "I intend to keep being so," he said. "Then that is what I need." The February timeline arrived with a particular brutality that tested every element of the plan. Prude sent the formal written notice on February 3rd, 60 days beginning from that date. Fitch confirmed the new deadline was April 4th. The spring cattle market in Wichita opened in the last week of March. It was close. Everything had to work. The drive to Wichita was a 3-day journey in reasonable conditions. They needed to take the best 60 head of cattle to market and return with enough capital to satisfy the debt at the bank. Chester had been corresponding, with Ida's authorization and under her direction, with a buyer in Wichita named Castellano who dealt in volume purchases and who had confirmed interest in the quality of the Garrison herd based on Chester's detailed description. The price being discussed was $38 per head, significantly above local rates. The night before the drive, Ida sat with Ellis and Chester in the kitchen and went over everything twice. Ellis, who had grown measurably over the winter in every way that mattered, was going to stay with the ranch while they were gone. This was a responsibility he received with the seriousness it deserved. "If Webb comes back," Chester said to Ellis, "you do not engage. You say Mrs. Garrison is away on business and will return shortly, nothing else." "And if Ridley himself comes?" Ellis asked. "Same answer," Ida said. "This is not a conversation Ellis needs to have with anyone. The ranch is not for sale and the bank cannot legally act until April 4th. We will be back long before that." Ellis nodded. He was 16 now, or nearly, and he had the look of a boy who was becoming a man in ways that the winter's work had accelerated, and Ida felt a complicated gratitude for Chester's part in that. The drive north was 3 days of cold and work, and the particular satisfaction of moving 60 healthy, well-conditioned cattle through the Kansas winter landscape with someone who knew what they were doing. They did not have a large crew. It was just the two of them, which was ambitious, but Chester knew the route and the cattle responded well to handling. And the nights they camped on the trail, Ida sat by the fire and watched the flat darkness of the Kansas prairie stretch to every horizon and thought about how much had changed since October. On the second night, when the cattle were settled and the fire was low, and the stars were doing their extravagant winter display above the Kansas sky, Chester sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they stayed like that for a long time without speaking. "What will you do?" Ida asked, "if the debt is paid and the ranch is stable?" He was quiet, considering. "I was hoping," he said, "that would be a conversation we had together." She tilted her head to look up at him. He was looking at the fire. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "Not yet," he said. "I am building toward it." "Building is taking some time," she observed. He looked down at her with that expression that was warmth and humor and something completely decided. "I want to do it right," he said. "I respect that," she said, and turned back to the fire and smiled where he could not quite see it. They arrived in Wichita on the third day with 60 head of cattle, and a scheduled meeting with Castellano that went, by the particular grace that sometimes visited careful preparation, exactly as planned. Castellano was a compact, efficient man who knew cattle and knew value, and Chester had not exaggerated a single detail in his correspondence, and the price held at $38 per head. And when Ida signed the bill of sale and received the bank draft in exchange, her hands were steady, and her face gave nothing away until she and Chester were outside on the Wichita Street in the cold February sunlight. Then she stopped walking and turned to him, and the number inside the bank draft was real and sufficient, and the relief was so large it came out as laughter, full and helpless. And Chester caught her face in his hands and was laughing too, and they stood on a Wichita Street in February 1883 like two people who had just done something difficult and necessary, and had come out the other side together. He kissed her there on the street properly, and a passing teamster gave them a cheerful shout, and Ida Garrison did not care in the slightest. They started back south the next morning, lighter without the cattle and faster for it. The ride back took 2 days, and they talked for most of it, the easy-ranging conversation of people who have stopped being careful with each other. Chester talked about Jackson County and his brother William in a way he had not before, with more complexity and less pain, and Ida thought this was because some of the weight had shifted, not gone, but redistributed across 2 people instead of 1. She talked about the future in specific terms. What the ranch could be in 5 years, how the mare's bloodlines could be developed, what it might mean to have a truly strong breeding operation rather than just a viable cattle operation. What it would take, Chester said carefully, is someone who intended to stay. Yes, Ida said, who considered it home. Yes, who had a stake in it. Yes, Ida said again, watching him. Chester brought his roan to a halt in the middle of the empty Kansas prairie under the enormous February sky, and Ida pulled up the bay mare beside him. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out something small, and she looked at it, and her heart did what hearts do when they recognize a moment they will carry for the rest of their lives. It was a ring. A simple one, a thin gold band with a small turquoise stone that was the color of the Kansas sky in summer, bought in Wichita at the jeweler's shop while she had been at the bank finalizing the Castellano transaction. Ida Garrison, Chester said, I came into this world without much that stayed. I have been moving long enough that I forgot what it felt like to stop. You are the reason I stopped. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she had been reading for 4 months and knew now by heart. I am asking you to let me stay. I am asking you to be my wife. I am asking if you will have me, with the full knowledge of everything that comes with me, the history and the complications and the brother who does not speak to me and the county in Missouri that remembers my name badly. Ida looked at the ring and at the man holding it, sitting on his gray roan in the middle of the Kansas winter, asking her something true. I will have all of it, she said. Yes. He put the ring on her finger and took her hand, and they sat there on horseback in the middle of the open land, for a moment that was its own complete world, just the two of them and the horses and the wide sky and something that had found its right shape. They rode home. Ellis was standing on the porch when they arrived, and his face went through several things in rapid succession when he saw their faces and then the ring, and he shook Chester's hand with a young man's careful solemnity, and then hugged Ida with the sudden complete feeling of a boy who has not fully shed his boyhood yet. You are staying, Ellis said to Chester. I am staying, Chester said. Ellis nodded as if something that had been uncertain was now settled, and he went back to the barn with an air of satisfied resolution that made Ida smile. Ida rode to Caldwell 3 days later and went to the First Commercial Bank and placed the certified bank draft from Castellano on Harold Pruett's desk without preamble. Pruett looked at it. He looked at it for long enough that Ida could see him calculating the absence of the outcome he had been expecting. The full outstanding balance, Ida said, plus the accrued interest through today's date. I would like a receipt marking the debt satisfied in full. Pruett picked up the bank draft. He turned it over. He put it down. I understand you have had some help with the property, he said, in the careful tone of a man who is trying to suggest something without saying it. I have had excellent judgment about who to trust, Ida said, which is something I have worked on for some years. Prout wrote out the receipt. Ida walked out of the First Commercial Bank of Caldwell, Kansas on the 21st of February, 1883 with a receipt in her hand and the debt of the Garrison Ranch paid in full, and she stood on the same boardwalk where she had stood in October and let the February sun do what winter sun did in Kansas, try its best against the cold, and she thought about the extraordinary ordinary chain of things that had led here. The auction, the bid, the question, the name. She thought about Chester asking her name before she had won the mare, right in the middle of the highest possible stakes of that particular small afternoon, as if he had decided that she was more important than the outcome of the bid, which she supposed, in retrospect, she had been. She had been the loudest bidder in the yard that day. She had been determined and visible and completely focused on what she needed. And he had been the quietest man at the entire auction, barely noticeable if you were not looking, and he had looked at her across the noise and the competition and the dust of the whole scene and thought, I need to know her name. She walked to the post where Copperhead was tied and she patted his old reliable nose and she thought, yes, well, I am glad he did. The wedding was in March before the spring turned fully warm in the Methodist Church in Caldwell where Ida had attended services since arriving in Kansas 12 years earlier. It was a small ceremony. Ida had no family within 200 miles. Chester had none at all in attendance, his brother William still unreachable in Missouri. Ellis Purdy stood up with Chester as the nearest thing either of them had to a witness of long standing. The minister's wife and 2 women from the congregation made up the rest of the gathering. But the church smelled of cedar and candle wax and early spring air coming through the cracked windows, and Chester stood at the front of it in his best coat with his hat in his hands and his gray eyes on Ida as she came down the aisle. And the expression on his face was so completely and simply his, that particular quality of undivided attention and genuine warmth that she had been cataloging since October, that Ida had to breathe very carefully to maintain her own composure. They made their vows to each other in the plain, direct language of the Methodist service, and Chester said his with the same quality she had come to know in everything he said, clearly, without performance, meaning each word individually and in full. When the minister said she could be addressed as Mrs. Covington, Ida thought about that for a moment. She had been Mrs. Garrison for 10 years, and the Garrison name was on the land and the deed and the stock records and the whole history of what she had built with Roy and preserved alone for 3 years. I am keeping my name alongside, she told Chester afterward, if that is all right. I am Ida Garrison Covington, both. Chester looked at her for the briefest pause and then said, of course, it is who you are. Which was, Ida thought, exactly right and exactly him. Spring arrived in the full Kansas way, sudden and extravagant after the long winter, the grass going from brown to green in what felt like a week, the sky lifting and expanding and recovering its enormous summer ambition. The Garrison property, the Covington property now by right of both their stakes in it, came into the season with the best preparation it had had in years. The cattle were healthy. The fence lines were sound. The barn was whole. The bay mare was confirmed in foal by a registered quarter-horse stallion from a reputable breeding operation, 40 miles north, that Chester had researched and Ida had approved. And the projected foal would arrive in late winter of 1884 with bloodlines that would make it worth serious money. Ellis Purdy turned 16 in April and accepted a modest wage increase that Ida insisted on and a kind of status in the operation that reflected what he had actually become over the winter, which was an indispensable part of how everything functioned. He had begun talking about eventually having his own operation someday with a specificity that suggested he was actually planning it, and Chester had begun setting aside time to teach him the things that would make that possible. Tom Ridley had nothing to say about any of it. The debt was paid. The land was not available. Webb had not returned. The consortium of local investors had found other opportunities. This was how the majority of frontier land schemes ended, when the woman they were counting on turned out to be incompressible under pressure. Summer was the season Ida loved best. The long days of full light and full work, the sky so blue and deep it seemed to have no ceiling, the grass and the cattle and the particular gold quality of a Kansas afternoon. Chester worked the land in summer the way he had worked it in every season, with complete focus and visible pleasure, and she saw in him what she imagined she had always been looking for without having vocabulary for it, a person who was genuinely at home in the work, not enduring it toward some future moment, but inhabiting it fully, the same way he inhabited every present moment she had observed him in. He wrote to his brother William in July. It was not the first time he had tried. There had been letters over the years that went unanswered, but he wrote again, carefully, honestly, telling William about the ranch and about Ida and about the years since they had last spoken, and he did not ask for reconciliation explicitly. He just sent the truth of his life and left the door open if William wanted to walk through it. "I do not expect anything," he told Ida, "but I wanted to try." "That is the right thing," she said. "Whether he answers or not." He received a reply in September that was 3 pages long. It was not warmth exactly, not the warmth of before. Some things cannot be recovered whole. But it was contact. It was the door cracking open. Chester read it at the kitchen table with Ida beside him and said nothing for a long time, and then folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. "He has a son," Chester said, 3 years old, named James." "That is something," Ida said. "Yes," Chester said, "it is something." Ida discovered in October, the first anniversary of the auction in Caldwell, that she was expecting. She told Chester in the morning, in the kitchen, before Ellis was up, and she watched the news travel across his face in the way it did, carefully at first and then unstoppably, the stillness giving way to something that was so simply and completely happy that it made her eyes sting in a way she did not permit in most circumstances. He crossed the kitchen and held her, and she leaned into him the way she had been leaning into the fact of him for nearly a year. "A year ago today," she said into his shoulder, "you asked me my name. And you were very irritated about the timing," he said. "I was not irritated. You were briefly irritated. It was a significant bid." "You won the horse," he said. "I won considerably more than the horse," she said. He held her more tightly, and she could feel him laughing quietly. "Chester," she said, "yes, you were the best thing that ever came out of an auction." The baby was born in July of 1884, a boy, solid and loud and equipped with Chester's gray eyes and Ida's stubborn chin, which Ellis declared a formidable combination when he first held him. They named him Roy Chester Covington. Roy for the man who had built the ranch and loved Ida truly, Chester for the man who had found it in her and chosen to stay, and the whole name held the full history of everything that had made this moment possible without denying any of it. Chester held the baby with the same quality of focused gentleness he brought to everything that required care, and Roy Chester Covington looked up at his father with the unfocused ancient gaze of the newly arrived, and seemed entirely satisfied with what he found. Wichita, October 1884. A year and a half after the cattle drive that had saved the ranch. Ida and Chester rode to the fall market with a trailer of cattle that would have made the previous year's Ida weep with the quality of them. They also brought 2 registered yearlings from the bay mare's first foal, who had arrived in January with exactly the bloodlines and conformation that the breeding plan had projected, and the yearlings attracted the kind of attention from serious buyers that produced the kind of prices that made a ranch not just viable but genuinely prosperous. On the way back from Wichita, riding through the early autumn light with the money in the saddlebag, and the October sky doing the particular thing it did at this time of year, Ida thought about October in Caldwell 2 years ago. The fence and the noise and the woman with her hand up and the quiet man nobody noticed. Chester rode beside her, and she looked at his profile against the sky and thought about all of it, the testimony in Missouri and the years of moving, and the morning he had ridden into her ranch on the gray roan, and the winter they had built a plan at a kitchen table, and the night they had figured out they were in love with each other while doing arithmetic, and the boy at home with Ellis who had his father's eyes. "What are you thinking about?" Chester asked, catching her looking. "The auction," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the moment you asked me my name. Do you know what possessed you to do it right then?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the road ahead. Then he looked at her, and the quality of his gaze was the same as it had been at the fence in Caldwell 2 years ago, that complete, unhurried attention. "You were the loudest person in that yard," he said. "And I do not mean that you were simply noisy. I mean that you were completely alive in a way that made everything else quieter by comparison. You were fighting for something you needed with everything you had, and you were not making it graceful or careful or apologetic. You were just doing it, fully, in public, without any of the hedging most people do." He paused. "I have spent my whole life being quiet because I learned that being loud came with costs. And there you were, loud in every good way, and I thought, I need to know who that is." Ida looked at the road ahead for a moment. "I thought you were asking to throw me off," she said. "I know," he said. "It almost worked." "I know that too," he said and smiled. She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand. And they rode like that for a while, hand in hand on the Kansas road under the October sky. Two people who had found each other at the highest point of a small, desperate moment, and discovered in each other the thing they had each been moving toward through all the years they had been moving. The Garrison Ranch, the Covington Ranch, their ranch, entered the winter of 1884 with full stores, a paid deed, a healthy herd, a barn that would not leak, and a family that had not existed 2 years before. Ellis would be 17 in the spring, and had already staked out in conversation the particular piece of land to the northwest that he thought might one day be his if the prices stayed reasonable. And Chester had been helping him save toward it with the methodical, practical love of a man who has decided what kind of elder he intends to be. Roy Chester Covington was 5 months old, and had developed a strong opinion about breakfast that he expressed at significant volume, and with his father's absolute conviction. Ida nursed him in the mornings in the kitchen while Chester made the coffee, and the sound of the baby's indignant morning announcements mixing with the sound of the coffee pot, and the early light coming through the windows, and Chester moving around the kitchen in his unhurried morning way was, Ida thought, the specific sound of a life that was exactly right. On an evening in November, with Roy asleep in his cradle near the stove and Ellis in the bunkhouse and the wind outside doing its measured Kansas work, Chester came and sat beside Ida at the kitchen table where she was reviewing the accounts, not because the accounts needed urgency, but because the habit of evening accounts had become the habit of evening closeness, and he set down a cup of coffee at her elbow and looked at the figures with her for a while. The numbers were good. Not extravagant, not without the ordinary risks that ranch life always carried, but stable and building, and pointed in the right direction. "We are going to be all right," Chester said. "We were always going to be all right," Ida said. He looked at her. "You always believed that." "I always decided it," she said, "which is close enough." He laughed, that low, warm sound she had been collecting since December of 1882, and he reached over and covered her hand with his, and the baby made a small, contented sound from the cradle as if in agreement. Outside, the Kansas wind moved through the winter grasses in the way it had always moved, without comment, without preference, the same wind that had been moving over this flat land since long before any of them arrived and would move over it long after. But inside the warm kitchen, in the particular circle of lamplight that held Chester and Ida and the sleeping baby and the tidy columns of a satisfying ledger, everything was decided and finished and whole. The quietest man at the auction had asked her name. The loudest bidder had given it. And from that single, unguarded, impractical, perfectly chosen moment, something entirely permanent had grown. Some years later, when people asked Ida how she had met her husband, she told the story the way it actually happened. The auction, the bid, the inexplicable timing of the question, the name exchanged over the noise and dust of the Caldwell yard. She told it plainly, the way she told everything, and the people listening usually laughed at the detail about the mid-bid interruption. What she said at the end, when the laugh had settled, was this: that she had gone to that auction to win a horse and save a ranch, and she had done both of those things, and she was proud of both. But the thing she had not gone there expecting and could not have planned for was the man at the fence who had looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in 100 miles of Kansas plain, and asked her name as if her answer was the only bid that mattered. And Chester, if he was present for the telling, would say nothing during the story because he never needed to perform the past when the present was right here. But at the end, he would look at Ida in the way he had always looked at Ida, with that complete and unhurried attention, and she would look back. And whatever had passed between them at the Caldwell auction fence in October of 1882 would be there still, unchanged and undiminished, as true and plain and permanent as anything that had ever lived on the open Kansas land.